December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. 7:57 in the morning. Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller was folding laundry in the belly of the USS West Virginia when the first torpedo struck. The ship lurched. Metal screamed. The world turned sideways. Miller dropped the sheets and ran toward the sound of general quarters, his heart hammering against his ribs as the second torpedo hit. Then the third. By the time he reached his battle station, the anti-aircraft battery magazine amidships, it no longer existed. Just twisted metal and smoke and the smell of burning oil spreading across the harbor like a black cancer. Miller was 19 years old, a former high school athlete from Waco, Texas, who had enlisted to escape sharecropping and poverty. The Navy had given him a uniform and assigned him to collect laundry, shine shoes, and serve food to white sailors. They had not trained him to fire weapons. They had not trained him to kill. But as Japanese planes screamed overhead, dropping bombs that turned battleships into funeral pyres, Miller did what countless soldiers would do throughout the war. He improvised. He adapted. He survived. Someone shouted for him to help carry the wounded. Miller's massive frame made him perfect for the task. He pulled men from pools of blood and burning fuel, dragging them towards safety as the West Virginia settled deeper into the harbor. Then he saw Captain Mervyn Bennion on the bridge, his abdomen torn open by shrapnel. Miller carried his dying commander to shelter, holding him as life drained away. Around them, the world was ending. The Arizona exploded with a force that lifted her out of the water. Over 1,000 men died in that single moment. The Oklahoma rolled completely over, trapping hundreds inside her steel coffin. Lieutenant Frederick White grabbed Miller's arm and pointed toward the bridge. 2 Browning M2 machine guns sat unmanned, their barrels pointing uselessly at the sky. The guns were water-cooled monsters, each weighing 121 pounds, designed to throw half-inch bullets at enemy aircraft. Miller had watched other sailors train on them, but had never touched one himself. Black sailors were not allowed. It was Navy policy. It was the law. White did not care about policy. He showed Miller how to load the ammunition belt, how to charge the weapon, how to aim. Then White moved to feed ammunition while Miller gripped the spade handles and squeezed the trigger. The gun roared to life. The recoil hammered against his shoulder. Spent casings fountained into the air, tinkling against the deck like brass rain. Miller swung the barrel toward a Japanese dive bomber that was pulling out of its run toward the Tennessee. He led the target like he was shooting quail back home. The tracers arced upward, reaching. The plane shuddered, and black smoke poured from its engine. It spun sideways and crashed into the harbor. Miller kept firing. The water jacket around the barrel began to steam. His arms burned. His ears rang. Japanese planes came in waves, their red circles bright against silver wings. Some carried torpedoes. Some carried bombs. All carried death. Miller fired until the ammunition belt ran dry. White fed another. Miller fired again. For 15 minutes, he poured half-inch bullets into the sky while the ship burned beneath him and men screamed and died all around. When the gun finally clicked empty and White shouted that they were out of ammunition, Miller looked down at his hands. They were steady. He had killed at least one enemy pilot, maybe more. He had defended his ship with a weapon he was never supposed to touch. The order came to abandon ship. The West Virginia was settling by the stern, her decks awash, her superstructure a twisted wreck. Miller was among the last 3 men to leave, swimming 400 yards through water thick with fuel oil while Japanese fighters strafed the survivors. That morning, 2,403 Americans died at Pearl Harbor. Miller was not one of them. The Browning M2 machine gun had just begun its war. The weapon in Miller's hands that December morning was the culmination of 2 decades of American arms development, a story that began in the closing days of World War I when the nature of warfare changed forever. General John Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Force in France, watched German armored vehicles and aircraft dominate the battlefield and realized the United States needed a weapon that could penetrate armor at range. The standard machine guns of the day, like the Browning M1917, fired 30 caliber rounds that bounced harmlessly off German armor plate. Pershing wanted something bigger. He wanted something that could kill tanks. The request went to John Moses Browning, a Mormon gunsmith from Ogden, Utah, who had already revolutionized American firearms with designs like the Model 1911 pistol and the M1917 machine gun. Browning was 63 years old in 1918, a lean man with wire-rimmed glasses and calloused hands who had been designing guns since childhood. He took his existing M1917 design and scaled it up, enlarging every component to handle a massive new cartridge. Winchester developed the ammunition, a rimless 50 caliber round that measured 12.7 millimeters in diameter. The bullet alone weighed over 700 grains, more than twice the weight of a 30 caliber round, and left the barrel at 2,700 feet per second. It could punch through an inch of hardened steel armor at 100 yards. Browning finished his prototype on November 11, 1918, the very day World War I ended. The timing seemed cruel, but the Army recognized the weapon's potential. They designated it the M1921 water-cooled machine gun and put it into production. The early versions were temperamental. The recoil was so violent it cracked the receiver. The barrel overheated after sustained fire. Browning died in 1926, leaving his son and a team of engineers to refine the design. They added a heavier barrel, improved the recoil buffer, and created an air-cooled version that eliminated the bulky water jacket. In 1933, the redesigned weapon entered service as the M2 heavy barrel, officially designated the Browning machine gun, caliber .50, M2, HB. American soldiers would call it Deuce. The M2 operated on Browning's signature short recoil principle. When the gun fired, the barrel and bolt recoiled together for a short distance, locked together by a rising breech lock. After about 3/4 of an inch of travel, the breech lock dropped, unlocking the bolt while the barrel stopped moving. The bolt continued rearward, extracting the spent cartridge and compressing the recoil spring. As the bolt moved forward again under spring pressure, it stripped a fresh round from the ammunition belt, chambered it, and locked into battery. Then the cycle repeated. The entire process happened in a fraction of a second. The M2 could fire between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, a steady, hammering rhythm that earned it nicknames like the Thumper and the Boomstick. But it was the ammunition that made the M2 truly devastating. The 50 caliber BMG round, Browning machine gun cartridge, came in multiple varieties. Ball ammunition for general purpose, armor-piercing rounds with hardened steel cores that could penetrate 22 millimeters of armor at 100 yards. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds that combined penetration with an explosive charge that ignited on impact, turning fuel tanks and ammunition stores into fireballs. Tracer rounds that burned bright enough to mark the bullet's path, allowing gunners to walk their fire onto target. Each round carried enormous kinetic energy, over 13,000 foot-pounds at the muzzle. When a 50 caliber bullet hit a human body, it did not make a neat hole. It destroyed everything in its path. The weapon weighed 84 pounds without the tripod, 128 pounds with it. 2 men could carry it barely. The barrel alone was 45 inches long. Fully assembled on its M3 tripod, the M2 stood over 3 feet tall and 5 feet long. A massive beast of machined steel and American engineering. It required a crew of at least 3, a gunner to aim and fire, an assistant gunner to feed ammunition and spot targets, an ammunition bearer to keep the gun supplied. In combat, those roles blurred. Everyone did everything. Everyone fought. The M2 was not the only heavy machine gun in World War II, but it was the most versatile. The Germans had their MG-34 and MG-42, lighter weapons with higher rates of fire that made them excellent infantry support guns. The Russians had the DSHK, a 12.7mm weapon similar in concept to the M2 but less reliable. The British relied primarily on smaller caliber weapons and American Lend-Lease M2s. But none of these weapons matched the M2's combination of power, range, and adaptability. It could serve as an anti-aircraft gun, an anti-vehicle gun, an infantry support gun, or a long-range precision weapon. It worked in the Arctic cold and the Pacific heat. It worked in the desert sand and the European mud. It worked on ships, on planes, on tanks, on jeeps, on tripods dug into defensive positions. It worked everywhere American soldiers fought. The Army Air Forces mounted M2s on nearly every combat aircraft that flew during the war. The lighter AN M2 variant, designed specifically for aircraft use, shed 23 pounds of weight by using a thinner barrel and eliminating the tripod mounts. The reduced weight came at a cost. The lighter barrel could not sustain fire as long without overheating. But at high altitude, with slipstream cooling and lower ambient temperatures, the gun could fire for extended periods. The AN-M2 had a cyclic rate of up to 850 rounds per minute, significantly faster than the ground-mounted version. It fed from disintegrating link belts that could be connected end-to-end for continuous fire. Fighter aircraft typically carried 6 AN-M2s. 3 in each wing positioned to converge their fire at a point several hundred yards ahead of the aircraft. This convergence point, where all 6 streams of bullets intersected, was called the harmonization zone. A P-51 Mustang pilot who caught an enemy aircraft in his harmonization zone could pour 3,000 rounds per minute into a target the size of a car. The effect was catastrophic. German fighters, built light for speed and maneuverability, came apart under that kind of firepower. A 1-second burst from 650 cals delivered 50 rounds. Half of those were armor-piercing incendiary. They shredded engines, punctured fuel tanks, cut control cables, and killed pilots. The P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 AN-M2s, 4 in each wing. The massive fighter bomber weighed 7 tons empty and could carry another 3 tons of bombs and rockets. It was a flying tank, built around a massive radial engine and an armored cockpit that could absorb incredible punishment. German pilots learned to fear the P-47. They called it the Jug because its broad fuselage looked like a milk jug. They also called it der Eisenkleidete Ritter, the ironclad knight. When a P-47 opened fire, it sounded like God tearing canvas. Pilots described the recoil from all 8 guns slowing the aircraft noticeably, like someone had thrown out an anchor. The 50 caliber rounds destroyed everything they touched. They punched through locomotive boilers and derailed trains. They turned truck convoys into burning wrecks. They collapsed bridges and demolished buildings. They killed tanks by shooting through their thin top armor. A P-47 pilot once described firing into a German column and watching the tracers disappear into a Tiger tank's engine deck. The tank coasted to a stop, smoke pouring from its hatches. The 50 cals had set the engine on fire. Heavy bombers carried even more firepower. The B-17 Flying Fortress bristled with 13 50 caliber machine guns in dorsal, ventral, tail, nose, waist, and cheek positions. The B-24 Liberator had 10. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber could be configured with up to 18 forward-firing AN-M2s for anti-shipping and ground attack missions. These gunships, as they were called, turned Japanese supply barges and small vessels into splinters. They strafed airfields and supply depots. They provided close air support for ground troops. The nose of a B-25 gunship, packed with 8 50 caliber machine guns, looked like a horizontal wall of gun barrels. When all 8 opened fire simultaneously, the effect was biblical. Targets simply disintegrated. Bomber gunners fought different battles than fighter pilots. They sat in cramped turrets, surrounded by thin aluminum skin and plexiglass, watching German fighters come straight at them. The fighters attacked from the nose, where the bombers' defensive fire was weakest in early models. They came in head-on at closing speeds of over 600 miles per hour, giving the bomber gunners only seconds to aim and fire. A good bomber gunner learned to lead his target, to fire where the enemy would be rather than where he was. He learned to ignore the tracers coming at him, the ones he could see, the ones that looked like they were flying straight into his face. He learned to focus on the sight and the trigger and trust that his armor and his luck would hold. Many times they did not. Over 45,000 American airmen died in combat over Europe. Many of them were bomber gunners who spent their last moments behind a 50 caliber machine gun, fighting to the end. On the ground, the M2 earned a different kind of respect. German soldiers called it a damned effective weapon. That was a translation, sanitized for historical records. The actual German term was considerably more profane. They hated the M2 because it made them helpless. German infantry tactics in World War II emphasized movement and infiltration. They advanced in small groups, using cover and concealment, closing the distance to American positions where their superior small arms, the MP-40 submachine gun and MG-42 machine gun, could dominate. But the M2 engaged targets at ranges where German weapons were useless. It fired accurately out to 1,800 meters, well over a mile. At that distance, German soldiers were tiny figures in field grey, running across open ground, diving for cover that could not protect them. The 50 caliber round did not care about stone walls or wooden barricades or sandbags. It went through all of them and kept going. American units used the M2 in the anti-aircraft role extensively. The M45 quad mount, nicknamed the Krautmauer or meat chopper, combined 4 M2s on a single powered turret. It was designed to shoot down aircraft, but proved equally effective against ground targets. The quad mount could put out 2,400 rounds per minute, a stream of fire that made suppression seem like an inadequate word. It annihilated. During the Normandy campaign, American anti-aircraft units used quad 50s to engage German infantry and light vehicles whenever the Luftwaffe failed to appear. One after-action report from January 1945 recorded a quad mount engaging 25 German aircraft attacking an Allied airfield. The gunners claimed 14 destroyed and 4 probably destroyed, firing 24,100 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, compared to 11 rounds of 90mm artillery and 1,270 rounds of 37mm and 40mm fire. The 50 caliber was not the most accurate anti-aircraft weapon, but there were a lot of bullets in the air, and the law of probability worked in the gunners' favor. Tank destroyers and light tanks mounted M2s on ring mounts, typically positioned on the commander's hatch, where they could be traversed 360 degrees. The guns provided anti-aircraft defense and suppressive fire against infantry. They were exposed positions. The gunner stood with his head and shoulders above the vehicle's armor, visible to every enemy soldier within rifle range. But the firepower was worth the risk. A tank destroyer with a 50 cal could suppress an entire enemy position, while the main gun acquired targets. The psychological effect was significant. The sound of a 50 caliber machine gun was unmistakable, a deep, rhythmic booming that carried for miles. When American armor rolled into a village and the 50 cals opened up, German soldiers knew they were outgunned. Many chose to surrender rather than face that wall of fire. The most famous use of an M2 on the ground occurred on January 26, 1945, in the Alsace region of France. The location was a frozen field on the outskirts of Holzwihr, a small village in the Colmar Pocket, the last German stronghold on French soil. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy, commanding Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, had positioned his men in the Bois de Riedvier, a forest that dominated the approaches to Holzwihr. Murphy was 20 years old, a slight man who stood 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 140 pounds soaking wet. He looked like he should be in high school. Instead, he was one of the most experienced combat soldiers in the US Army, with 9 months of continuous fighting across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France behind him. He had already earned 2 Silver Stars, 3 Purple Hearts, and a Distinguished Service Cross. He was also exhausted, sick with malaria, and commanding a company that had been chewed to pieces in the fighting to secure the forest. On the morning of the 26th, Murphy's company held a ragged line at the southern edge of the woods. They had 2 M10 tank destroyers in support, positioned astride a dirt road. Behind them were 47 infantrymen, all that remained of Company B after days of brutal combat. Murphy was on the field telephone calling back to battalion headquarters for reinforcements when the German counterattack began. 6 tanks, probably Jagdpanthers or Jagdpanzer-I-Fools, emerged from Holzwihr, accompanied by approximately 250 infantry in white winter camouflage. They were hard to see against the snow-covered fields. Murphy spotted them at about a mile out. They advanced in textbook fashion, the tanks providing covering fire while the infantry moved in bounds, using the rolling terrain for cover. Murphy adjusted artillery fire, calling in concentrations that killed dozens of Germans but did not stop the attack. The Germans advanced to within 500 yards. One of the tank destroyers took a direct hit and began to burn. The 5-man crew bailed out and ran for the rear. Murphy ordered his company to fall back into the forest. He stayed at his forward observation post, a shallow ditch at the edge of the tree line, continuing to direct artillery fire. German tanks were now abreast of his position, less than 200 yards away. Infantry in white camouflage suits were closing in. Murphy was alone. He had expended all his carbine ammunition. He should have withdrawn. Instead, he looked at the burning tank destroyer and saw the M2 Browning on the turret ring. It was still intact. The ammunition cans were still attached. Murphy ran to the destroyer and climbed onto the back deck. The vehicle was burning. Fuel and ammunition were inside, any of which could explode at any moment. Murphy did not care. He grabbed the spade grips of the 50 cal and swung it toward the German infantry. The gun was already loaded. Murphy pulled the trigger and the M2 roared. German soldiers, advancing in a skirmish line across the open field, started falling. They went to ground, looking for cover that did not exist. Murphy traversed the gun, firing short bursts, conserving ammunition. He could see officers trying to rally their men, waving them forward. Murphy shot the officers first. He shot the men carrying radios. He shot the men carrying machine guns. He shot anyone who looked like they were organizing an assault. The Germans tried to flank him. Murphy swung the gun and cut them down. They tried to rush him. He stopped them with sustained fire that turned the snow red. For over an hour, Murphy stood on that burning tank destroyer and fought an entire German company by himself. He was wounded in the leg, probably by shrapnel or a rifle bullet. He ignored it. German tanks were firing at him. Their machine gun rounds sparked off the M10's armor. Murphy kept firing. He was in constant communication with the battalion fire direction center via the field telephone, adjusting artillery strikes that landed danger close, within 100 meters of his position. Shell fragments whistled past his head. He did not flinch. The tank destroyer burned beneath him. Heat waves shimmered around the turret. The engine compartment was a furnace. Murphy's hands were burned from touching hot metal. He kept firing. The German attack broke. They could not advance across that field of fire. They could not flank the position because Murphy's artillery fire blocked every route. They could not knock out the 50 cal because the M10's armor protected Murphy from everything except a direct hit. And Murphy had become very, very good at not getting hit. When the Germans finally withdrew, over 50 of them were dead or wounded. Murphy had fired every round of 50 caliber ammunition on the tank destroyer. When he climbed down, his uniform was smoking. His hands were blistered. Blood soaked through his right boot from the leg wound. He walked back to his company's position, organized a counterattack, and drove the remaining Germans out of the area. Then he collapsed. Medics evacuated him to a field hospital where he spent a month recovering. The Medal of Honor citation arrived while he was still hospitalized. He was 20 years old. Murphy's action at Holtzwihr became the most famous single use of the M2 in World War II, but it was far from the only time the gun turned the tide of battle. In the Pacific, Marines used M2s mounted on Amtracs and light tanks to clear Japanese bunkers and pillboxes. The 50 caliber round could penetrate the coconut log and coral rock construction the Japanese used for fortifications. On Iwo Jima, a Marine gunner on an M4 Sherman tank fired over 900 rounds from his turret-mounted 50 cal, suppressing Japanese positions while engineers demolished them with flamethrowers and satchel charges. On Okinawa, a Quad 50 mount engaged a banzai charge at night, the 4 guns firing in unison, the tracers lighting up the darkness like a horizontal lightning storm. Over 200 Japanese soldiers died in that attack. None reached the American lines. Navy vessels mounted M2s for close-range anti-aircraft defense. PT boats carried them for attacks on Japanese barges and small coastal vessels. The 50 caliber round could punch through the thin hulls of enemy landing craft and set fuel tanks ablaze. Submarine chasers and destroyer escorts used them against surfaced submarines. The firepower was devastating at close range, shredding periscopes and deck guns, killing crew members, forcing submarines to dive before they could fire torpedoes. Coast Guard cutters escorting convoys across the Atlantic used them to engage German aircraft that ventured too close. The M2 was everywhere, in every theatre, in every branch of service. It was ubiquitous in the way that only truly successful weapons become. The gun's reliability was legendary. It worked in temperatures ranging from -40 degrees Fahrenheit in Alaska to +130 degrees in North Africa. It worked in rain, in mud, in sand, in salt spray. It worked when caked with ice, when filled with dust, when corroded by months of exposure to tropical humidity. Armourers joked that the M2 had only 2 settings, fire and not fire, and the second one usually meant the gun was out of ammunition. When properly maintained, which meant cleaning and lubrication after firing and inspection of critical parts, the M2 could fire tens of thousands of rounds without a mechanical failure. The barrel would wear out eventually, losing accuracy as the rifling eroded, but even a warm barrel could still fire. Crews carried spare barrels and could change them in the field, a process that took about 5 minutes with practice. The Germans respected the M2, but they also feared it. There are no confirmed reports of them calling it a miracle, but the historical record contains numerous examples of German soldiers expressing grudging admiration for American firepower in general, and the 50 caliber machine gun specifically. Field Marshal Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, reportedly said that if the German Air Force had possessed the Browning 50 caliber, the Battle of Britain would have turned out differently. This was likely an exaggeration, the kind of statement military leaders make when looking for excuses for failure, but it contained a kernel of truth. German fighters in the early war period used rifle-caliber machine guns and 20mm cannons. The machine guns lacked stopping power. The cannons were powerful but had low rates of fire and limited ammunition. The American 50 caliber hit a sweet spot between the two, combining high rate of fire with devastating projectile energy. It was not as powerful as a cannon, but it was far more practical. German ground troops had a more direct and visceral opinion. They described being on the receiving end of 50 caliber fire as terrifying. The sound was distinctive. a heavy, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that was slower than the ripping canvas sound of the MG-42, but somehow more menacing. The bullets made a sound in flight, a supersonic crack followed by a deep buzz as they passed overhead. Near misses sounded like someone had swung a baseball bat past your ear. Direct hits were catastrophic. A .50 caliber round that hit a man's center mass did not wound him. It removed everything from the chest to the pelvis. Survivors described comrades being hit and simply coming apart, torso separated from legs, organs exposed. Medics could do nothing. There was nothing left to treat. German veterans interviewed after the war consistently rated the M2 as one of the most effective weapons in the American arsenal, second only to the M1 Garand rifle. Some rated it first. The Germans had no equivalent weapon. Their heavy machine guns were lighter and more mobile, but fired smaller caliber rounds. They had no vehicle-mounted heavy machine gun comparable to the M2. Their anti-aircraft guns were either too small, 20mm or 37mm, or too large, 88mm. The .50 caliber filled a niche the Germans had not recognized existed. It was the perfect weapon for mechanized warfare, powerful enough to damage armored vehicles, accurate enough to engage aircraft, mobile enough to be mounted on anything with wheels or treads. American production capacity turned the M2 into a war-winning weapon through sheer numbers. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced nearly 2 million Browning M2 machine guns in all variants. Companies that had never made weapons before, like AC Spark Plug, Frigidaire, and Guidelamp, retooled their factories to produce gun components. The supply chain was a marvel of industrial logistics. Iron ore from Minnesota became steel in Pittsburgh. Steel became forgings in Detroit. Forgings became machined parts in dozens of factories across the Midwest. Parts flowed to assembly plants where they became complete weapons. Weapons flowed to ports where they were loaded onto ships and sent to every combat theater in the world. From raw material to battlefield took less than 90 days. The ammunition logistics were equally impressive. A single .50 caliber round required brass for the cartridge case, lead and copper for the bullet, gunpowder for the propellant, and a primer to ignite it. Multiply that by billions. American factories produced over 3 billion rounds of .50 caliber ammunition during the war. That number is almost incomprehensible. 3 billion rounds. If you lined them up end to end, they would wrap around the earth over 4 times. Stacked in boxes, they would fill over 40,000 railroad freight cars. The ammunition went everywhere American forces went, stockpiled in depots, loaded in trucks, carried in ships, flown in transport aircraft. Every combat unit had access to as much .50 caliber ammunition as they could use. German units rationed machine gun ammunition. Japanese units often ran out entirely. American units fired until their guns glowed red, and then fired some more. The cost was substantial. A single M2 machine gun cost the government approximately $14,000 in 1945 currency, equivalent to over $200,000 today. Each round of .50 caliber ammunition cost approximately $5, $75 in modern terms. An average P-51 Mustang carried 1,800 rounds, which meant the aircraft carried over $135,000 worth of ammunition in today's money, and that load was expended in about 30 seconds of continuous fire. The B-17 Flying Fortress carried over 11,000 rounds across 13 gun positions. A single mission consumed over $800,000 worth of ammunition in current value. But the United States could afford it. The American economy in World War II produced more war material than all other combatant nations combined. The M2 Browning and its ammunition were a tiny fraction of that output, but they represented something larger. They represented American industrial might, the ability to produce weapons and ammunition in such quantities that victory became inevitable. Not everyone behind a .50 caliber machine gun survived. Staff Sergeant Henry Red Irwin, radio operator on a B-29 Superfortress, earned the Medal of Honor after a white phosphorus marker flare ignited inside the aircraft. Irwin picked up the burning flare with his bare hands and threw it out a window, saving the crew but suffering horrific burns that disfigured him for life. He survived. Others were not as fortunate. Doris Miller, the cook who manned the .50 cal at Pearl Harbor, died 2 years later when the escort carrier Liscombe Bay was torpedoed during the Battle of Makin in the Gilbert Islands. Miller was among the 950 crew members killed when the torpedo hit the ship's bomb magazine and the carrier exploded. He was 24 years old. He never got to see the Navy cross that admiral. Chester Nimitz presented to his mother on his behalf. Audie Murphy survived the war and became the most decorated American soldier in history with 33 awards and decorations including the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. He returned to civilian life and tried to become an actor, eventually appearing in 44 films, most of them westerns. He played himself into Hell and Back, a 1955 film adaptation of his autobiography, but Murphy never escaped the war. He suffered from what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. He had nightmares. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He sometimes woke up swinging. He became an advocate for veterans with psychological wounds, arguing that the government had an obligation to provide treatment. In 1971, Murphy died in a private plane crash in Virginia. He was 45 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and his grave remains one of the most visited in the cemetery. People still leave flags and coins and flowers. They remember. The M2 Browning did not end with World War II. It fought in Korea, where the harsh winter of 1950 proved its cold weather reliability. It fought in Vietnam, where Marine sniper Carlos Hathcock used an M2 equipped with a telescopic sight to make a confirmed kill at 2,560 yards, over 1.5 miles, a record that stood for 33 years. It fought in every American conflict since then. Desert Storm, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. It serves today on vehicles, ships, and aircraft. It guards forward operating bases. It protects convoys. It sits on the turrets of Humvees and MRAPs and Strykers. Over a century after John Browning designed it, the M2 is still in frontline service. No other weapon system can make that claim. Not the M1 Garand, retired in the 1960s. Not the M14, replaced in the 1970s. Not the M16, being phased out now in favor of newer designs. The M2 endures. Why does it endure? The answer is simple. It works. The design is robust. The cartridge is powerful. The weapon is reliable. Modern variants include quick-change barrels and improved sights and lighter materials, but the fundamental design remains unchanged. It is still a short recoil-operated, belt-fed, air-cooled heavy machine gun that fires 50 caliber BMG ammunition. It still weighs 84 pounds. It still has a 45-inch barrel. It still fires between 450 and 600 rounds per minute. It still kills everything it hits. Engineers have tried to replace it. They have built lighter guns with higher rates of fire. They have developed new calibers and new propellants and new designs. None of them has been significantly better. Some have been worse. The M2 remains in service because no one has designed anything that can do its job better. The weapon's influence extends beyond its direct combat effectiveness. The M2 shaped American military doctrine. It enabled mechanized warfare by providing vehicles with firepower sufficient to engage both ground and air targets. It changed aircraft design by forcing engineers to create fighters that could carry multiple heavy machine guns and absorb the recoil. It influenced ammunition development, spawning an entire family of 50 caliber weapons systems, including anti-materiel rifles and grenade launchers. It created a logistics infrastructure that continues to support 50 caliber weapons worldwide. Over 60 countries use the M2 today. It is the standard heavy machine gun of NATO and dozens of other nations. When American allies receive military aid, M2 Brownings are often part of the package. The weapon has become a global standard, but weapons are just tools. They do not win wars by themselves. They are instruments wielded by human hands, and their effectiveness depends entirely on the courage, skill, and determination of the people who use them. Doris Miller was not trained to fire the M2, but he fired it anyway, and he saved lives. Audie Murphy stood on a burning tank and fought an entire German company because someone had to, and he was the one there. Unnamed gunners on thousands of battlefields from Normandy to Iwo Jima to the Ardennes forest did their jobs, hour after hour, day after day, until the war ended or they died trying. The psychological impact of the M2 cannot be measured in statistics or after-action reports. It existed in the minds of German soldiers who heard that distinctive boom and knew what was coming. It existed in the confidence of American soldiers who knew they had overwhelming firepower on their side. It existed in the calculations of German commanders who had to factor the 50 caliber into every tactical decision. Attack across that open field. The Americans have 50s on the far ridge. Advance down that road. There's probably a 50 cal covering the intersection. Assault that position. Count on taking casualties from the 50 before you even get close enough to use your own weapons. The M2 created a bubble of denied terrain around American positions, a zone where movement meant death. German infantry could cross it, but they paid a terrible price. The weapon also changed how soldiers thought about distance. Before the M2, machine gun engagements typically occurred at ranges under 500 meters. The M2 extended that to over a mile. Enemy soldiers who thought they were safely out of range discovered they were not. Enemy vehicles that tried to bypass American positions by driving through fields or along distant roads found themselves under fire from guns they could barely see. The psychological effect was corrosive. If you were never safe, never out of range, never beyond the reach of American firepower, why keep fighting? Why not surrender? Many did. Prisoner interrogation reports from the European theater consistently mentioned the .50 caliber as a factor in German soldiers' decisions to give up. It was not the only factor. German soldiers surrendered because they were exhausted, hungry, outnumbered, and knew the war was lost. But the .50 caliber contributed. It made fighting seem futile. In the Pacific, the psychological impact was different but equally significant. Japanese soldiers and sailors fought with a fanaticism born of cultural conditioning and military indoctrination. They did not surrender easily, but they feared the .50 caliber. American strafing attacks by P-51s and P-47s armed with M2s destroyed Japanese airfields, supply depots, and troop concentrations. Japanese soldiers learned to dig deeper foxholes, build stronger bunkers, hide better. But the .50 caliber found them anyway. It penetrated their fortifications. It destroyed their equipment. It killed them in their hiding places. Japanese veterans who survived the war described American air power as the worst aspect of their combat experience. Worse than the artillery. Worse than the naval bombardments. Worse than the flamethrowers. The .50 caliber machine gun, delivered from above by diving fighters, was the cutting edge of that air power. American bomber crews developed an almost superstitious reverence for their .50 cals. Gunners named their weapons. They painted kill markings on the barrels. They performed maintenance rituals that bordered on obsessive cleaning and oiling and checking headspace and timing, making sure the gun would work when needed. Because their lives depended on it. A jammed gun in a bomber turret meant one less defensive position, one more avenue of attack for German fighters. Gunners died because their guns jammed. Other crew members died because a critical gun position went silent at the wrong moment. So gunners maintained their weapons with religious devotion. They treated the M2 like it was sacred. In a sense it was. It was the thing that kept them alive. The most unusual application of the M2 in World War II occurred during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The German offensive caught American forces by surprise, punching through the Ardennes forest in eastern Belgium and Luxembourg. Hitler had committed his last mobile reserves, 28 divisions including elite panzer and SS units, to a desperate gamble aimed at splitting the Allied armies and capturing the port of Antwerp. If successful, the offensive would force the British and Americans to negotiate a separate peace, freeing Germany to concentrate on the Soviet threat in the east. If unsuccessful, Germany would have no reserves left and the war would be lost. The offensive initially succeeded beyond German expectations. American units, thinly spread across the Ardennes, crumbled under the assault. Entire regiments were surrounded and destroyed. The front line bent backward, creating a bulge on the map that gave the battle its name. But the Germans had launched their offensive during a period of terrible weather. Heavy clouds and fog grounded Allied aircraft. Without air support, American ground forces had to fight with the weapons they carried. That included thousands of M2 machine guns mounted on tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, and anti-aircraft positions. At a town called Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and attached units dug in and refused to surrender despite being completely surrounded. The Germans demanded capitulation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the defenders, sent back a one-word reply: nuts. The siege continued. German infantry and armor attacked repeatedly. The defenders held, in part because they had concentrated their heavy machine guns at key positions around the perimeter. When German tanks tried to break through, they encountered walls of .50 caliber fire that killed supporting infantry and forced the tanks to retreat. The defense of Bastogne became legendary, but it was only one example of how American units used their heavy machine guns during the Bulge. All along the front, isolated units improvised defensive positions and held out against overwhelming odds. They used their M2s to dominate key terrain features, deny roads and bridges to German forces, and break up infantry assaults. The guns fired day and night. Barrels overheated and were changed. Ammunition ran low and was conserved. When supply trucks finally broke through to surrounded units, ammunition was the first priority. Food and medical supplies came second. The defenders needed bullets more than they needed anything else. The weather cleared on December 23rd. Allied aircraft took to the sky in massive numbers. Fighter bombers armed with 50 caliber machine guns and rockets descended on German columns that had been advancing with relative impunity for a week. The effect was apocalyptic. Thousands of German vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, armored cars, and tanks were caught on narrow roads in the Belgian countryside with nowhere to hide. American P-47s and P-51s strafed the columns repeatedly, flying mission after mission until their guns were empty and their ammunition exhausted. The roads became junkyards of burned and shattered vehicles. The German offensive ground to a halt, not from lack of fuel or ammunition, though both were critically short, but from lack of mobility. The 50 caliber machine gun, firing from the sky, had killed the Bulge. By early 1945, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Germany was being crushed between the Soviet Union advancing from the east and the Western Allies advancing from the west. The Luftwaffe had been shot from the sky. The Wehrmacht was being bled white in battles it could not win. German cities were being reduced to rubble by around-the-clock bombing. But German soldiers continued to fight, partly from fear of Soviet retribution, partly from loyalty to their units and comrades, partly because they had no choice. Desertion meant execution. Surrender meant imprisonment and possible death. So they fought on, and they died, and the M2 Browning killed many of them. In the Pacific, the end came more suddenly. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war ended without the need for an invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation that would have cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese deaths. The M2 Browning would have played a major role in that invasion. American plans called for overwhelming firepower to suppress Japanese defenses, and 50 caliber machine guns would have been everywhere, on landing craft, on tanks, on aircraft, providing close support. The guns would have killed until there was nothing left to kill. The atomic bombs made that unnecessary. The invasion never happened. The guns fell silent. When peace came, the American military began the long process of demobilization. Millions of soldiers returned home. Thousands of ships and aircraft were mothballed or scrapped. Mountains of equipment were sold off as surplus or destroyed. But the M2 Browning remained in service. The weapon was too useful, too reliable, too effective to retire. The Cold War began almost immediately after World War II ended, and America needed weapons for the conflicts to come. The M2 transitioned seamlessly from World War II to Korea to Vietnam to the War on Terror. It adapted to each new conflict, each new enemy, each new battlefield. The fundamentals never changed. Point the gun at the target, pull the trigger. Watch the target die. The men who used the M2 in World War II are almost all gone now. Doris Miller died in 1943. Audie Murphy died in 1971. The youngest veterans of World War II are in their late 90s today. They are disappearing at a rate of over 300 per day. Soon there will be none left. Their stories will survive only in books and films, and the memories of those who knew them. But the weapon they used, the M2 Browning machine gun, endures. It sits on military bases around the world, still ready, still lethal, still in use 87 years after it was designed. That longevity is unprecedented in military history. No other weapon has remained relevant for so long. The reason for that longevity lies not just in the weapon's mechanical excellence, though that is significant. It lies in the fundamental physics of warfare. The 50 caliber cartridge delivers enough energy to damage or destroy most threats a soldier will encounter on a modern battlefield. Light vehicles, helicopters, drones, personnel, structures, all are vulnerable to 50 caliber fire. The M2's range allows it to engage targets before they can close to effective range with their own weapons. Its reliability means it works when needed. Its simplicity means soldiers can maintain and repair it in the field with minimal tools and training. These characteristics do not become obsolete. They remain valuable regardless of how technology evolves. But there is another reason the M2 endures, one that has nothing to do with ballistics or engineering. The weapon represents a philosophy of warfare that is distinctly American. Overwhelming firepower, mechanical reliability, industrial might. The M2 embodies all of these concepts. It is not elegant or sophisticated. It is a brutal instrument designed to kill efficiently at long range. It works in any environment, requires minimal maintenance, and can be operated by any soldier with basic training. It turns one soldier into a force multiplier, giving them the ability to dominate terrain and suppress enemy forces. These are the principles that guided American weapons development throughout the 20th century, from the M1 Garand to the M16 rifle to the M2 Bradley fighting vehicle. Design weapons that work, build them in enormous quantities, give them to soldiers who know how to use them, trust the combination to win wars. The M2 Browning proved that philosophy correct. It was not the best heavy machine gun in World War II by every metric. The German MG42 had a higher rate of fire. The Soviet DSHK had a slightly more powerful cartridge. But the M2 was good enough, reliable enough, and there were enough of them to equip every unit that needed one. That was what mattered. Wars are not won by perfect weapons. They are won by weapons that work well enough, produced in sufficient quantity, wielded by soldiers brave enough to use them. The men who manned the 50 cal in World War II understood this instinctively. They did not care about specifications or technical comparisons. They cared whether the gun would fire when they pulled the trigger. They cared whether it would keep firing until the enemy was dead or had run away. The M2 did both. That made it a good gun. That made it a war-winning gun. That made it the gun they trusted with their lives. There is a photograph from 1944 that captures something essential about the M2 and the men who used it. The photo shows a young soldier, maybe 20 years old, sitting behind an M2 mounted on a jeep somewhere in France. He is wearing a steel helmet and a field jacket. His hands rest on the spade grips of the gun. His face is turned toward the camera, and his eyes are looking directly at the lens. The expression on his face is tired but determined. He has seen things. He has done things. He will see and do more before the war ends if he lives that long. The gun in front of him is clean, well-maintained, ready. The ammunition belt feeds from a can on the side of the mount. The barrel points toward the horizon, toward the enemy, toward whatever comes next. That photograph could be from any battle in World War II. It could be from any war since then. The uniform details change, the vehicle changes, the background changes, but the essential elements remain constant. A young soldier, a machine gun, a war to fight. The soldier does not look heroic in the traditional sense. He does not look like he is enjoying himself. He looks like someone doing a difficult and dangerous job because it needs to be done, and he is the one there to do it. That is what combat looks like. That is what all wars look like when you strip away the propaganda and the speeches and the flags. It is young people with weapons, scared and tired and determined, doing what they have been trained to do because the alternative is unacceptable. The M2 Browning was the weapon many of them used. It was not romantic. It did not make killing clean or easy or noble. It just made it possible. It gave them a tool powerful enough to defend their position, protect their friends, and kill their enemies. They used it because they had to. They became expert with it because their lives depended on expertise. They maintained it with obsessive care because a broken gun meant death. And when the war ended, many of them never wanted to see the weapon again. They went home and tried to forget. They tried to build lives that had nothing to do with killing. Some succeeded, some did not, but they all remembered the gun. They remembered the sound it made, the recoil against their shoulder, the smell of burned powder and hot oil. They remembered the targets, the ones that fell and the ones that got away. They remembered their friends who died next to guns that jammed or ran out of ammunition, or were simply overwhelmed by too many enemies coming too fast. Those memories are fading now. The men who carry them are dying. Soon, the M2 Browning will be the only witness that remains, still serving, still killing, still doing the job it was designed to do over a century ago. It is a remarkable achievement. It is also a tragedy, because weapons that never become obsolete mean wars that never stop. The M2 has been fighting for 87 years. It will likely fight for decades more. That longevity is a testament to engineering excellence. It is also a reminder that humans have not found a better way to resolve their differences. We still build guns. We still train young people to use them. We still send them off to kill and die in causes we tell ourselves are just and necessary. The weapons get more sophisticated, the killing gets more efficient, but the fundamental nature of war never changes. It remains what it has always been. Young people with weapons, scared and determined, doing terrible things because someone in power decided it was necessary. The M2 Browning machine gun, called Majus by the soldiers who used it, called the 50 cal by everyone else, called a devastating weapon by the Germans who faced it, sits ready today on military bases around the world. It is cleaned and oiled and maintained by soldiers, who have never met the men who used it in World War II, but who are part of the same unbroken chain that stretches back to Pearl Harbor and Normandy and Iwo Jima and all the forgotten places where young people fought and died. The gun connects them across the decades. It is a machine, nothing more. but it carries the weight of all those who used it, all those who died behind it, all those who killed with it. It is a monument in steel and gunpowder to human ingenuity and human violence, to our ability to create remarkable things and our insistence on using them to destroy each other. That is the story of the M2 Browning. It is not a story about a miracle weapon. It is a story about a very good gun used by very brave people in a very terrible war. The gun worked. The people fought. The war ended. The gun remained. And somewhere, right now, a young soldier is sitting behind an M2 Browning machine gun, hands on the spade grips, eyes on the horizon, waiting for whatever comes next. The weapon is ready. The soldier is ready. The war, whatever war it is this time, continues. And the gun, that remarkable, terrible, enduring gun, keeps doing what it was designed to do. It kills. It has been killing for 87 years. It will likely kill for 87 more. That is not a miracle. That is just what weapons do. They endure long after the people who created them have turned to dust. Long after the wars they fought have faded into history. The gun remains. The killing continues. And we call it progress.